Last week, I got an email about an interesting project that was right up my alley. The creators of In Search of Darkness, a horror movie documentary series, comes TERRORBYTES, a project focused on exploring the history of horror games past and present. From indie darlings to mainstream masterpieces. But before they make the project, the team wants to hear your thoughts. What horror games do you want to know more about? What kind of information do you want to know? Click on the link in the description to learn more about the project and, most importantly, fill out the survey to let them know what you think and to show your interest in this amazing project. A lot of video game history is lost to us or just not well recorded. And a series like this could go a long way to filling in some of those gaps. If you love horror like I do, let the team know that you're excited for TERRORBYTES. Miyako-no-jo, a city in the Miyazaki Prefecture, on the southern island of Kyushu, Japan, a land of farmers and agricultural manufacturers. In the early 1970s, it was home to about 130,000 people, a small, countryside town where Toyama Keiichiro was born on January 1st, 1970. Toyama's parents owned a local convenience store. His grandparents ran a sweet shop. Growing up, he spent his time investigating ghosts with his friends, reading horror manga and books about Western occultism during the height of Japan's occult boom, a period of intense interest in the supernatural and the unseen. Once he graduated high school, he moved to Tokyo and applied to art school because he hated math. In 1990, he started studying film and analog video at Tokyo Zokei University. Once graduation was looming, he found himself driven to find a way to make a mark on the world. He'd never considered games as a career until a Sega representative came to his school looking for recruits. He was offered a job at the first place he'd applied to. He accepted. So began Toyama Keiichiro's career at Konami Computer Entertainment, Tokyo. And so begins the story of a career in games that would span decades and change the course of the horror genre forever. The story of a director and his team who would help create the foundation of a series that continues to frighten and fascinate fans the world over. This is the story of Silent Hill.
業界に入った年が、大学出て94年ってことはプレイステーションが発売になった年なんですけど、サターンと。だからその時に途中までやってるプロジェクトとかも全部凍結になって振り直されて、オリンピックハイパーオリンピックインアトランタっていう ゲームをやったりとか、そういう。
Toyama Keiichiro wouldn't go to work right away. First, he had to go back to school, specifically to Konami's development school in Kobe, where he would stay for a month, learning how to make games alongside other newbies to the company. After the first general training session, Toyama was already stressed, afraid he wouldn't be able to do it when faced with learning the etiquette of working adults. But the switch to technical training completely changed his mind. At the time, the computer of choice at Konami was the Mac, which likely explains why the fonts used in Silent Hill years later were basic Mac fonts. Toyama was learning not only computer basics, but also pixel art, and his teacher was Matsui Naoki, lead designer of the Gradius series. And his classmates included Ishikawa Fumi, lead illustrator of Suikoden 2 and 3, Komatsubara Reiko, character designer for the Tokimeki series, and Shinkawa Yoji, lead artist for Metal Gear. The year was 1994, likely sometime around May, when Konami released the first game in the Tokimeki Memorial series. Toyama says he remembers when he started working with the company because it coincided with the game's debut. His training would even involve working on it. He helped create the minigame Stardust Symphony EX. Once his stint at Konami School was done, he was assigned to Development Department Group 6, led by Kurita Yukito. Initially, he was assigned work on a game, bug checking for Sparkster, a side-scrolling platformer that released in September of 1994. In those days, Toyama stood out a bit at the office. He had long, waist-length hair and dressed in clothes from Nakaya Mugendo, which according to Japanese Wikipedia is a store specializing in goods from India and Southeast Asia. At company karaoke, Toyama was the only one who didn't know the chorus of the theme song of Space Detective Gavin, a popular TV show that aired in the early 80s. But the show was never broadcast in Toyama's hometown in Kyushu. Toyama's first big project as a new employee would be working on the Sega CD port of Snatcher, the classic futuristic noir game directed by Kojima Hideo. The famous director would not be involved in the port, however, because that's how things worked back then. Instead, it would be led by Sasaki Yoshinori of Gradius fame. 5 of Toyama's fellow newbies would be working on the game with him. He does not name them, but examining the credits of the Sega CD port, it seems likely those newbies were his fellow graphic designers, including Kimura Mihoko and Koike Junko, 2 artists who would go on to work on Silent Hill. They weren't the only ones. In fact, Yamaoka Akira was also involved, though apparently Toyama had no idea. The lead designer overseeing them was Kuchibushi Satoshi, who would also be heavily involved in Toyama's future career. He came to games from the animation world, and Toyama credits the man as his second and last teacher in his gaming career. While computers were a big part of development, there were still many more changes to come in the next few years. During Toyama's time on Snatcher, he didn't have a personal computer. He had one device that was solely for pixel art and nothing else. There was no LAN, no email, no electronic bulletin boards. Instead, Toyama submitted daily handwritten reports to director Yutaka and lead designer Kushibuchi. It was a very different time. The Sony PlayStation would release in December of 1994, and it was around that time that Konami would make the decision to have its Tokyo offices change course. Toyama remembers a day when everyone in Tokyo development was called together to meet with visitors from Konami's head office. At the meeting, the teams were told their development plans were being put on permanent hold. Toyama had been working on an American football game that would never see the light of day, and would be the only such project in Toyama's career. Instead, the Tokyo offices would begin to work on 3D development for the upcoming Sony PlayStation. Toyama remembers the audience that day feeling agitation and confusion. It wasn't the only big change. Kirita Yukito left the company, and Yutaka Haruki, formerly the deputy manager, became the leader of Development Group 6, a man Toyama would later credit as one of the biggest benefactors of his gaming career. Before the PlayStation was released, Toyama wasn't honestly that impressed. He thought it was a sure failure. There was a lot of gossip going around at the company, too, discussing with surprise how new games were supposed to be made without sprites or backgrounds, that in fact everything was made with polygons. When the console finally released that December, Toyama went out and bought one, and his opinion quickly turned around. As the shift to 3D began, Development Group 6 was divided into new game production teams. Toyama excitedly went to check these assignments and found his name on the 3D Track and Field team. He wasn't sure what that meant. Trucks and fields? Was it related to war? Would he get the chance to draw something cool like mecha? A coworker let him know the disappointing truth. Track and Field was the foreign name for the Hyper Olympics series, a sports-based game. The team involved a few folks Toyama already knew, including Kushibushi Satoshi as director. It also included 2 team members he would come to know well, Imamura Akihiro and Oshima Naoto, programmers on Track and Field. Imamura Akihiro is from the same island Toyama is, Kyushu. He was born in 1970 in a small town that no longer exists today, in the Kagoshima Prefecture. He would join Konami after studying engineering at the University of Tokyo, graduating in 1994. For Track and Field, he would be working on the user interface and sequence programming. Toyama Keiichiro would be assigned to the Track and Field team not just as a character designer, but a motion editor, working on the very new technology of motion capture. 3D tech was something Toyama had been learning unofficially for a while, using the Macs at work to train on Strata Studio, a 3D CG production software. It wasn't the most advanced program, but it introduced Toyama to the basics and the concepts he would need to understand and work on Olympics. Once he began working on Olympics, he received a better machine and began using Softimage, an SGI program that was much more advanced than what he'd been previously using. Still, the program had its limits. It had no way of creating shadows, so Toyama used colors to create shading that gave the illusion of shadows. He would design the uniforms for the characters based on the country's flags. Kushibuchi was directing the motion capture. Athletes from a local university's track and field club were asked to come in as actors, and Kushibuchi himself was the actor who did the fist bump in-game. Once those actions were recorded, the data was given to Toyama. Today, that data would have been adjusted ahead of time, assigned to its character model, but back then, the data was left completely as is, which was unusable. Toyama had to do the work himself, transforming the mocap data into in-game motion. The work took days of trial and error, and there was no one to ask for advice, because this was an entirely new process Konami had never done before. At least, not in the Tokyo offices. The swimming, however, couldn't be motion captured. Toyama would manually add those motions using rotoscope in Softimage. Close to the end of production, Toyama began to regret that the competitors in their game were performing with no audience. He brought it up and it was dismissed because the game was so close to finishing. So he approached his teammate Oshima Naoto and asked for help. The man agreed and submitted the updated version of the game without permission. Oshima Naoto was behind the camera work and 3D backgrounds of Track and Field, and his work was popular among his supervisors, especially the water effects, which were really impressive for the time. And no, he is not Oshima Naoto of Sega fame. Work on Hyper Olympics or International Track and Field would come to an end. And for a while, Toyama was assigned to the Sexy Parodius team, which was working on porting the arcade shooter to PlayStation and Sega Saturn. That was where he would meet another young employee of Konami, a man Toyama felt was somewhat eccentric. He had a mobile phone, a rarity in the mid-90s. and he was a bit miffed about his work on 2D art when he joined the company looking to work on 3D. That man was Sato Takayoshi, an artist born and raised in Tokyo. In 1992, he attended Tama Art University, studying sculpture, fine art, and eventually majoring in oil painting. Konami hired him sometime around June of 1996. His first project as an artist was working on the sexy Parodius port, where he happened to meet Toyama, a project that ran from April to August of 1996. He was the central artist working 15-hour days, 7 days a week for 5 months. It was hell, in Sato's words, made worse for the fear Sato felt about his future at Konami, as Toyama had heard firsthand. Sato had no 3D experience, but it was clear that was the way the industry was going. His work on Parodius was entirely 2D, and he feared he was building a skill set that would soon become obsolete. The only solution was to learn 3D, which he did on his own after hours, working at midnight to teach himself the basics. It was at that point he began appealing to his higher-ups for 3D work. He felt strongly in his 3D capabilities and was eventually given the chance to work on 3D. But the projects were small, creating letters for subtitles, working on UI, and sorting files. Older employees in the company, who knew nothing of 3D, coming to Sato for assistance and receiving credit for work Sato did for them. The priority given to age and seniority in a Japanese company was frustrating Sato's own goals, and eventually he made the decision to take a big risk and put it all on the table. He created a short 4-second example of the kind of 3D he was capable of, sidestepping his direct superior, and went to the higher-ups. He asked to be placed on a major project, or he wouldn't be teaching anyone else. His bosses finally agreed. September of 1996. Toyama Keiichiro had been at Konami for about 3 years and had just finished his first major project, International Track and Field. The director of Development Group 6 summoned 2 members of the track and field team to his office. Those men were Kushibushi Satoshi and Toyama Keiichiro.
ハイパーオリンピックアトランタのリーダーの僕の師匠、櫛渕さんっていうのと僕と部長に呼ばれて、次どうするっつってハイパーオリンピックイン長野かホラーか
すごい選択肢です。
いやでもだから僕その時はでも先輩だからいやどっちかっつうと長野よりはホラーやりたいなと思って。いやなんだろうな。オリンピックの続編というか長野オリンピックかサバイバルホラーかって言われたんですよ。
すごいギャップですよね。なんか選び方がこう卓上に並べるとなんかおかしいじゃないですか。一個はなんか普通のフレンチでこっちはカー消しみたいなカー消し食えみたいな。こっちは遊ぶこっちは食べるよっていう。で
まあでも2人呼ばれてそのハイパーオリンピックのディレクターやってた先輩と僕とって呼ばれて、まあ先輩が多分僕は新しいことやりたい言ってたから、そういうのもあって僕はオリンピックの続編やりますんでって言ってくださったんで、自然とじゃあサバイバルホラーで。
Konami saw Capcom's success with Resident Evil, known as Biohazard in Japan, and wanted a chunk of the horror market for themselves. Toyama remembers being in a state of excitement with mixed feelings of relief and joy. He'd spoken often about his desire to work on something new. Had his superior remembered that and made this choice for his benefit? Was he about to be given the chance to work on a completely new idea? He was. Yukata assigned him to the new project, tentatively titled Horror Adventure. The only others assigned to the team at the time were 2 of the programmers from Track and Field, Imamura and Oshima. Not long after, the artist Sato Takayoshi joined them, making a team of 4. But Toyama had to wonder, who was the director of this new project? Yukata told him quite simply, "It's you." the heart of Silent Hill's team came together that September, bringing with them an incredible variety of interests and influences. Toyama and Imamura, both from the more rural areas of Kyushu, brought with them childhood experiences from older-fashioned rural environments and the kinds of traditions that are home to those regions. Toyama and Sato, both creatives who studied at an art university, brought with them the influences that were popular in art student circles. Toyama himself wanted to include an alternative sensibility from his interests, naming music styles such as noise, industrial, New York punk, trip-hop, Japanese new wave, and the mute label. This desire to include music influences may even include creating playlists for the team. Ito Masahiro, a later addition, discusses the music he listened to while working, including Prodigy's The Fat of the Land, Aphex Twin's Come to Daddy, and Anima. In one of those memories, he mentions one of the songs was from a list Toyama made. In film, it was directors like David Lynch, Alejandro Jodorowsky, and Jan Svankmajer, as well as David Cronenberg, Sam Raimi, and Dario Argento. In horror games at the time, B-movies and American slashers were the major influences behind games like Alone in the Dark and Resident Evil. Toyama wanted to draw from a different experience and create a game with a unique feeling. Sato's interests included contemporary philosophy, literature, and cultural history. He felt that artists should have more understanding of the world than just their craft, in order to create capital A art. While Imamura enjoyed suspense, the surreal and strange, and leaned more towards mystery than violent or supernatural horror, the works of David Lynch, especially Twin Peaks, as well as the film Jacob's Ladder, were some of his favorites. In fact, Toyama himself hadn't been a fan of horror films at that time. He'd never really seen them, being too afraid to watch. But as the horror adventure team came together and began exploring ideas, he knew it was time to change that. He rented a bunch of horror films and quickly fell in love, for the most part. He'd already loved ghost stories and horror comics and stories of aliens, but splatter horror was his weakness. As they did their research, the team began to consider what was most frightening to them. What could be the central focus of fear in their new game? Toyama knew right away his own idea of fear: darkness. A terror originating in his childhood. The house he grew up in was an old-fashioned Japanese home full of dangers. A Showa-era house with an outhouse rather than a bathroom inside. Waking up in the middle of the night, having to navigate dark, unlit halls to go outside, before running back into the house as quick as he could. Those were memories that would stick with him. The fear of what couldn't be seen. It was a kind of fear Resident Evil hadn't used, and Toyama felt strongly it could make their horror project stand out in comparison. It wouldn't just be physical darkness either. Toyama wanted to explore the darkness of the heart. But how could they create darkness in a video game? Toyama's idea centered on the usage of layers and maps on a pre-rendered screen. Ideas centered on the usage of 2D graphics, which would emulate the appearance of darkness by darkening parts of the screen. While they were working on this, Oshima Naoto pointed out point lighting might work instead. Point lighting is a 3D effect that uses a central point from which light emanates in all directions, mimicking the way real-life lamps and flashlights work. With a 3D polygonal figure, it resembles real-life shadowing and illumination, creating a very real sensation of darkness. It just so happened another Konami project was working on a similar lighting system, and Toyama was sent the prototype to examine. It was a house, a 10-meter square floor, and a very low polygon figure of a girl in 3D. He was impressed, and the team decided to implement that system in their own game. However, the system had a limit. It couldn't light up everything well, but Toyama felt that could work with their concept. Darkness is atmospheric, and in horror, you shouldn't be able to see everything. Once they decided on point lighting, that meant the game would need polygons by default. Point lighting wouldn't work on 2D backgrounds after all. The game would be 3D, and it would open up the possibility of using camera work. They would be able to use depth cueing, a technique in which light sources are brightened up close and darkened farther away, further hiding the map from players. The problem was, this was a technique that required a lot of processing, which might mean you could have a light source while everything it illuminated looked terrible. Their first big obstacle was finding a way to implement the system in a way that was going to look good. It was Toyama who would make the suggestion that would change everything. If you made the space outside the aura of light completely black, you could erase any models that were out of sight. By limiting the draw distance, you limit the processing required. They could make the immediate surroundings look good and erase the distance, and the player would never know the difference. The group was not starting entirely from scratch. The game engine for horror adventure would be the same one used for track and field, which both programmers were already familiar with. What they had to do now was create a concept for their horror game and use this engine to make a world to fit it. Toyama knew early on that camera work would set their game apart, if it were possible. Resident Evil hadn't been able to use dynamic moving camera angles, but a fully 3D game could mimic movies and television in the way the camera moved, how it framed scenes. Years before, Toyama had seen the release of Dr. Hauser, a 3DO horror title only released in Japan, and the usage of moving camera angles was one of its greatest strengths. One of their first challenges was finding a way to implement those camera movements in horror adventure. Sometime later, Konami's Metal Gear Solid would release with camera angles, surprising Toyama and his team. He'd had no idea another division was working on something similar to what they wanted to create. A major problem they faced was realism. They attempted many varieties of model for their town and found it often felt lacking. The game couldn't handle rendering a large amount of detailed scenery. One way Oshima tried to work around it was to try and combine the model of a tree trunk with leaf billboards to represent a tree. But the texture of the leaves didn't look good and there wasn't enough memory to increase the resolution. Toyama had the idea to tilt the texture 45 degrees, which made the texture become wobbly and distorted, making it look like a leafy tree from a distance. As the project progressed, a concern came to dominate Toyama's mind. He was still new to the industry, only having worked on 2 projects, and this was his first time directing. He was insecure, unsure how to write a horror story to go with their ideas. Toyama was young for a director, and had only been at the company for 3 years, with only 1 official project under his belt, and the idea of creating an original story and presenting it to his superiors was, in his words, terribly embarrassing. He fought with his anxiety over presentation and considered handing the role to another team member, but he also really wanted to create something typical of Hollywood. How could he do that without facing the embarrassment of directly writing the story? As they researched, and Toyama considered the problem, the team whittled down their concepts to a few options, focusing on things that are already existing concepts in the horror genre, but aren't common in gaming. One consideration was a Lovecraft theme. In the early 90s, the Japanese TV channel TBS aired a Japanese adaptation of Shadow of Innsmouth, reimagining the story as set in Japan. The story struck Toyama, but it was rejected as the premise for this game. Toyama wouldn't forget it though. In his words, a work in the vein of Cthulhu set in Japan. That idea would come back. The other direction Toyama favored came from when he first moved to Tokyo from the countryside. As a kid in Kyushu, when he'd grown up reading and watching on TV was very different from his contemporaries in Tokyo, and attending art school in particular made him feel a bit out of touch. So he started trying to fill the void in his knowledge by working part-time at Studio 924, a movie rental store in Kokubunji. He thought he'd be able to watch movies for free, which wasn't true, but it did lead him to discover many of the films that would influence his own works. Back in those days, he remembered there was a corner of the store dedicated to films based on the work of a specific American author, Stephen King. The store manager told Toyama that King was a best-selling author of horror, and Toyama remembered the man's name years later. If it sold so much, there must be something to it. Through King, Toyama discovered the modern horror genre, bought some books, and started reading. In one tweet, Toyama discusses how reading modern horror made him feel. That world was shocking. A boring landscape filled with mass-produced products, stagnating peace, selfish people, a depiction of daily life full of thorough realism and surrealism that cannot be expressed in words, mixed together casually. I was overwhelmed by immersion. This kind of worldview in a game might work. In fact, wouldn't it work well as an adaptation, like they do in movies? If Toyama was to present a story that wasn't written, but was adapted by him, he could get around the anxiety of creating something new, while also being certain the work was a suitable horror story that would make a good game. The proposal, which was presented to director Yukata, centered on the challenge to adapt an original novel into a game, presenting three possibilities: Phantom by Dean Koontz, Stinger by Robert McKimmon, and The Mist by Stephen King. The director asked Toyama who they should narrow it down to, and Toyama said, yes, since he's the king. The word he used on Twitter was Osama, meaning ruler, but of course, he was making a pun about Stephen King and his incredible popularity. The Mist, the story of a small American town overcome by a strange fog full of monsters, would become the final contender and source of inspiration for their game. It worked marvelously with the idea of hiding the game in darkness, though whether the book's concept came first or the programmer's concept is unclear. Adapting it to a screenplay was tough, however. Trying to be faithful might end up boring, since much of the plot was slowly paced and unsuited to a video game. However, making changes means it's not exactly an adaptation anymore. Even worse, reaching out to King's people on the other side of the ocean hadn't gone their way. King wasn't interested. Just when Toyama had been at a loss for what to do, the department director called him back to his office. Go to America and persuade King. Apparently, Toyama made a very funny high-pitched noise in response. Sometime in late 1996, 3 more members were added to the horror adventure team. One was another programmer, Mizuochi Yuki, who would work on character motion. One was Sato Naoko, the team's first female member, who was a designer in charge of enemy modeling and motion. She worked on unit design for the characters in a tactical RPG called Vandal Hearts, which released in October of 1996. It's likely it wasn't long after the team's establishment in September that these team members were added to Horror Adventure. The last of the trio was a designer who had no experience in games whatsoever, Takahashi Isao. Born in Machida near Tokyo, Takahashi found his way into the video game industry via television. He worked on commercials, but had been so impressed by Resident Evil, he decided to enter the games industry. The department director assigned him to the Horror Adventure team, realizing his interest in horror made him a perfect match. Since he'd come from television, Takahashi had no experience with how games were made, and Toyama decided this was a good thing. He wasn't biased or set in his ways. His style would be very different by design because he hadn't been steeped in gaming traditions. It would be Takahashi's job to map out and design their small American town. The next 3 team members to join Horror Adventure likely came along in March or April of the following year, the time when school students graduate in Japan, and 3 new graduates were hired and assigned directly to the team. There are 2 programmers who are unfortunately left unnamed in Toyama's recollections of these events, but given the clues we have, it's possible he's referring to Sugai Kazutoshi, an enemy programmer on Silent Hill, and Owaku Hiroyuki, who would be the event programmer. Toyama does name the 3rd new hire, a young artist named Ito Masahiro. Born in 1972 in Fukuoka, Ito Masahiro was raised in Saitama, a part of the Greater Tokyo area. He joined Konami after graduating from Tama Art University and was immediately assigned to Horror Adventure. Ito was an artist who would leave a profound impression on Toyama. Recalling their first meeting decades later, Toyama commented he'd seen many newcomers over the years, many of them talented. but still having a ways to go for their art to approach the professional level. Not so with Ito Masahiro. Examining the young man's portfolio, Toyama was gobsmacked, thinking, "Did you draw this?" He found it hard to believe the work he was seeing had been drawn by a student. He says Ito was a man outside the norm, and few artists have so impressed him with their work. Silent Hill was Ito's first project, and it seems director Toyama would act as his teacher, instructing him how to use the 3D soft image program designers used to model the game. At the time, Ito apparently asked him, "Why should I put textures on polygons?" The two of them seem to have enjoyed working together, as another tweet from Toyama reads, "I miss Ito-kun, who was so terrible he started to create data that floated from the surroundings and I was worried about how to fit it." These are the last team members Toyama describes entering the team. His online recollections of Horror Adventure don't include the addition of at least 10 members, 8 of whom were background designers, 2 monster programmers. It's likely they were later additions to the team, brought on to cover the heavy workload late in development. Director Yukata, leader of Development Group 6, the man who had handed Toyama leadership of the team and guided his choices throughout the project, would receive a promotion. He joined the board of directors of KCE Yokohama, a studio founded in March of 1997, and his idea to send Toyama to the United States to meet Stephen King would never come to fruition. His replacement would be Kitao Gozo, a longtime Konami producer who started in sales in 1998. After director Yukata's promotion, Kitao became the director of Development Group 6 and the man overseeing production of the unnamed horror adventure. The first conversation he had with Toyama centered on the project. What were they going to do with it? The game had been in development for at least 6 months, and the team still hadn't received permission from Stephen King to adapt his story. Toyama was beginning to have second thoughts about the adaptation, thinking perhaps they'd be better off doing an original story instead. He explained this to his new producer, who thankfully trusted the man's opinion, and gave the team the green light to start an original story. Toyama was surprised at how easy it was to convince the man, but Kitao was from an economics background, not a creative one, and Toyama felt he was inclined to trust the creatives on site for that reason. While it was no longer necessary for Toyama to go to the United States to convince Stephen King, he still wanted to go. Their game was based on America, and it felt important they see an American small town beforehand. Toyama wasn't the only one pushing for a trip to the US. Another team member, Inaba Harry Haruhiko, was pushing for it too. Harry Inaba graduated from Kanagawa University in Yokohama in 1993 with a degree in English literature and communication. He joined Konami right out of school, and his skills with English would see him transferred to KSET to work on translations and voice direction. It was Inaba who pushed for Konami to send the horror adventure team to visit a city in the United States. Such a trip wasn't the norm at the time, but he felt it was clear the team needed some references from a real American city to create their game. From that point on, he was involved in the game's development and passionate about it, assisting in translating the script into English and hiring and directing voice actors. Kitao Gozo was willing to send the team west, but wanted to wait for the right time. They made it a trip for interviewing, and chose Chicago as the location, due to the presence of Konami offices there. The right time finally came that summer at E3, which in 1997 was in Atlanta, Georgia in late June.
Lapse photography, the Underground takes you for a quick look inside E3 and the making of Sony's outrageous booth from the ground up.
The trip coincided with the presentation of Metal Gear Solid at E3, a game that was also from Konami. Toyama remembers watching the trailer with shock, thinking by comparison, in his game you could only beat him to death with a steel pipe. While in Atlanta, he took the time to look at the sights, specifically the Coca-Cola Museum. And he did wander on his own for a while, though he'd been warned it was dangerous. He was fine, though a local he asked for directions apparently scammed him out of $2. After E3, the Konami team, which included Toyama and Inaba, were flying back to Japan, but first they'd take a pit stop in Chicago, Illinois. When the hill found in the demos of the game reveal the area map was originally for an area named Wrightwood, and Wrightwood is a neighborhood of Chicago, one that even decades later shares many similarities with Silent Hill. It's not the area's only claim to fame. The house shown in the establishing shot of Family Matters was in the same neighborhood. It also may not have been the only part of Illinois to influence the game. Toyama doesn't talk about other trips, but there's an interesting coincidence when you compare Silent Hill's town map to Buffalo, Illinois. Buffalo is a small town with a school in the bottom left, a square-shaped central map, and a smaller upper section of town that nearly maps out to Silent Hill directly. In addition, early versions of the game included police cars which read Buffalo on the side. That may have been another of the town's original names. Sometime around the end of June 1997, Toyama and Inaba would return home, and the project would begin turning in a new direction. They had the green light to create something original. They had photos and film footage to reference, and the majority of the team had been gathered together. It was time for Silent Hill's development to truly begin. A residential area. It's raining. In pitch black darkness, the light of a flashlight is floating. A strange, fetus-like creature is wriggling in an alleyway. Our hero approaches, an iron pipe in hand, and swings downward. The lying creature crawls awkwardly, trying to escape. The hero approaches and stomps on it. There's silence, and blood mixes with the rain. The concept, described on Toyama's Twitter, was the origin for the monster Larval Stalker, the invisible childlike monster who could originally harm the player. You can see evidence of that in the original E3 trailer. The idea finds its roots in an artist Toyama has long taken inspiration from, Morohoshi Daijiro, a manga artist, more specifically his story Kodomo no Asobi, or Children's Play. It was an idea developed not long after the switch to the original concept, though when Toyama asked Ito to design the creature, he felt the outcome was too cute, so the director ended up creating it himself. The fog and darkness, the small American town, the monsters hidden out of sight, a man walking down a long alleyway striking a monster with a lead pipe. These images and concepts were central to Silent Hill from early on, and would remain major features of the final game. But instead of adapting Stephen King's story, the team would tell their own. Around the time this decision was made, the team had been working for at least 6 months to a year, from September 1996 to June of 1997. This meant they had a year of content made and weren't going to be able to create a world to fit their story. They had to fit their story to the world they already had. As such, their story wouldn't work as a traditional narrative. So, they would emphasize the vagueness of their narrative and make it into a nightmare. Dreams don't have normal logic. They don't follow normal patterns. To explain the unexplainable, they would set their story inside a dream. That story was written by Toyama, but it was very much a team project, according to the director himself. I just let things settle themselves into place. It's my first time as a director, and I was keen to get the team's ideas into the project. They had decided to make their game 3D, in part to allow for the usage of moving, dynamic camera angles that games like Resident Evil couldn't use on pre-rendered backgrounds. The programmer behind those angles would be Oshima Naoto, and those angles would involve some of the most difficult programming challenges in the game. In 2D games, or games with 3D figures on 2D surfaces, the world the characters are moving in is flat. Whatever shadows or overlaps the game is meant to have are drawn into the background for the most part. In full 3D, however, the world is entirely rendered, which means figures can overlap and create shadows on one another. A technique used to handle these considerations is Z-buffering. Without it, various textures would all overlap whenever objects were moved to coincide. It essentially tells the computer what shadow to prioritize when multiple objects, like a person, a chair, and a table, are all casting shadows on the space and each other. When creating the various camera angles of Silent Hill, the team had to deal with issues with the Z-buffer. Every time they moved the camera, it would break the priority of various objects, and they'd have to go in and fix the overlaps that occurred. The Z-buffer is mentioned as one of the largest issues the team had in interviews, and it's likely Oshima was the main person dealing with the corrections, as he was the programmer behind the camera angles. The story of Silent Hill was always the story of a small American town. That one aspect never changed, and so the creation of the town was a major project from the very beginning. More people would be assigned to background design than any other aspect of the game, with a total of 11 designers working on the appearance of the town inside and out. But the most prominent of them would be Toyama himself, lead designer Takahashi Isao, and designer Ito Masahiro. One of the goals of the team's town design was a seamless, vast city, a town in which the player could go any and everywhere. Many of the locations are ripped from American life. Storefronts are based heavily on real stores. Who would design these locations? We know for certain who designed some of the major locations of the game. Toyama Keiichiro was behind the 2D maps of the Otherworld School, the above-ground levels of the Otherworld Hospital, and the sewers. You can thank Toyama for the body falling out of the school locker, too. Takahashi Isao and Ito Masahiro, two of the earliest team members hired to work on scenery, likely had the greatest influence on the town and its design. Takahashi was in charge of the town in general, and he and Ito would divide the Otherworld between them, with Takahashi designing and modeling the outside and the first alleyway section. Ito Masahiro would model the inside, particularly Midwich Elementary, a project which took 2 weeks, as well as the Gillespie House and the hospital basement. When it comes to designing scenery, Takahashi has a detailed approach. Scenery involves thinking about everything in the game, not just what things will look like, but how they will move, what's happening in the background, what's happened before, and what hints were left behind. One developer would comment on Takahashi's style with a story of how he'd spent a great deal of time considering how wind would move through the streets of Silent Hill and altering the town's design accordingly. In addition, none of these environmental designs originated in paper concepts. There was no concept art for the game. Instead, they were designed and modeled in Soft-Image 3D, and any shadows cast were painted onto the textures, as there weren't any programs to do it for them back then. The first time the two met, Ito was delighted to learn he and Takahashi shared an interest in the film Jacob's Ladder. When Ito went to see it in theaters, the seats had been nearly empty. No one had really been interested in the film at the time. Finding another fan had been delightful to him, and one night while they were up late working, the two spent quite a while discussing the film's merits, and the terrifying scene in which Jacob is brought down a long hallway on a hospital bed. That scene would heavily inspire the Otherworld, and may have been the inspiration behind much of the hospital-themed elements in the Otherworld background, including 3 wheelchairs, one in the alleyway, one in the Otherworld school, and one in the hallway of the hospital basement. The number 3 was meant to be meaningful for the game's story of revenge and Cheryl's memories. Ito Masahiro was given a great amount of freedom in his work on the Otherworld. However, Toyama did give him some instruction. In reference to the school, he asked Ito for something realistic that included a drainage ditch and a truck protruding from the wall, which was apparently a reference to a Morohoshi Daijiro manga. His work on the school would also lead to Ito designing the Seal of Metatron, which first appeared there. The paintings throughout the game, including the large school office paintings and many others, were also Ito's work. Before Ito began developing his pieces for Silent Hill, he actually took an unsanctioned day off. He spent that day wandering abandoned areas of the Japan Railway, specifically Ueno, Okachimachi, and Shinagawa stations, taking photographs that would influence his vision of the otherworld. He also names Kowloon Walled City as an influence and bought an expensive photo book on the city for reference, a book on medieval European torture, specifically in reference to the hanging cages in the school, as well as the films Cure and Angel Heart. The greatest influence, however, would definitely be Jacob's Ladder. Ito decided to use the film as a major source of inspiration in an attempt to differentiate the game from Resident Evil. In particular, the noise effect in the game was inspired by a VHS copy of the film. It wasn't the only film to have an influence on the town's appearance. In the book Siren Maniacs, Takahashi Isao mentions one of his favorite films, and one of the most influential on his work, is the horror movie Hellraiser, based upon Clive Barker's story The Hellbound Heart. The first otherworld change has Harry walking down a long alleyway in which the world begins to grow dark and strange things begin to appear. Blood, chains, barbed wire, and incredibly emaciated bodies, tied up and hung in the air, become apparent the further Harry goes. The way that the ordinary world suddenly gives way to an impossible, dreadful new realm, how the human body is twisted and transformed into something grotesque, is all incredibly reminiscent of Hellraiser, and this portion of the game was designed entirely by Takahashi. Some elements of the otherworld were designed in part due to the PlayStation's limitations. The heavy usage of fences and grates, especially in the otherworld, related to the console's restrictions. It was an easy, repeatable pattern. Created by 0.8 by 0.8 m tiles, because the 0.1 tiles were apparently too large. Ito wanted to use the fence concept to represent Alessa's closed heart. Other repeated patterns included the textures the team used to give the game a rusted, aged feeling. A fan online found what is likely the source images used to create it. Silent Hill was a constant battle. The team was always having to cut corners to get rid of ideas that were too difficult to accomplish, having to finagle the system to make their game work. Behind those layers of fog, many of the game's assets are only half created. Houses with no roofs, cars with no sides to cut down on the processing load. The reflections of boats in the marina are just boats flipped upside down. The PlayStation was not strong enough for some of the ideas the team had, and cutting corners helped to take some of the load off the game. They wanted the player to be able to climb walls, for the backgrounds to be more realistic, for there to be breaking glass and visible bullet holes. None of it was possible, but they managed with what they had, using technical aspects to hide their limitations. The dark shadows and foggy streets kept the less polished pieces of their game hidden. Sato Takayoshi would be the CG director of the game. Not only would he create the game's FMV cutscenes, he would design the characters who appeared in them. Much like the environmental artists, there would be no 2D concepts, and Sato would instead design the characters digitally, long before the story was set in stone. Some of the basic ideas behind the characters may originate in the Myst concept. The story centers on a father and his child and includes a female religious fanatic. Then there's characters who appear to come from other famous horror movies. An early version of what looks like Lisa is wearing a simple white outfit. But Lisa's final design is famously taken from The Exorcist III. A female nurse in the film wears the same outfit. Another example is Alessa's design. Her outfit is very similar to the character of Pamela Franklin in The House on Haunted Hill, and an early demo image of her is named Pamela. Sato's work on Silent Hill would heavily focus on expression and detail. Every facial expression would be done by hand. Each character had signatures meant to make them stand out. Dahlia's, for instance, was her withered neck. The skin from clavicle to jaw was slack and wrinkled, an effect that was difficult to achieve at the time. Sato's early start on developing characters and scenes may be why the trailer that plays before the game contains scenes that aren't in the final product, such as Lisa and Kaufman appearing to have an argument, and Dahlia running into a strange temple. Sato's locations would also be drawn from artistic inspirations. It's likely his CG version of the Gillespie house came before the in-game model, and it's heavily influenced by Christina's World, a painting by Andrew Wyeth. The story of Stephen King's The Mist is a monster story. The fog that takes over the small American town brings with it strange creatures from another world. The earliest versions of the game were always going to include monsters, and those monsters needed artists to design and model them. According to Ito, he designed about half the monsters, with Toyama and Sato Naoko finishing the rest. Toyama created the dog, likely referring to the groaners and wormheads, as well as the air screamer. Sato Naoko's design work included the nurses, presumably the doctors, as well as the insects, the moth and the twin feeler. Her parasitic health workers took heavy influence from her appreciation for Japanese horror. She was imagining the Ring's infamous Sadako when she designed them and their motions in the game. The artists behind these monsters didn't just design them, they also created the models and the animations. There was no mocap for the monsters. They were animated by hand. This led to an interesting mistake.
もっと昔ですけど、サイレントヒル作ってた時に、モーションが間違ってたやつがあって、当時の、まあそんな昔だから、キャラとクリーチャーと今でいう、まあ、リグというか、棒の構造とかが大差ないというか、同じ構造をほぼのに流すみたいなのをやってたんですよ。そしたら、サイレントヒルに、ちょっとでけえゴキブリのクリーチャーが、クリーパーがいたんですけど、それに人のモーションが入っちゃったことがあって、チェックしたらゴキブリが歩いてきたことがあって。
こうしてでしたね。怖いわ。
すっごいびっくり。
いやー、わかりますわかります。
There were many, many monsters made for the first Silent Hill, more than were ever used in the game itself. There were about a dozen monsters to be found in the source code, which never appear in the game, varying from insectoid creatures, perhaps more of Sato's designs, and a chicken-like creature that may have been a boss. The creation of Silent Hill would involve writing a story, building a town, animating monsters and characters, but it would also involve creating puzzles for the player to solve, a process that was in the hands of one team member. That team member was Owaku Hiroyuki, the event programmer for Silent Hill. Event programming handles the creation of interactive events, like using special keys and items, meaning that Owaku would both write and program the puzzles of the game. Placeholder images found in the code of Silent Hill's demo disc shed some light on the process of creating the town's puzzles. Many of these images, which include Japanese text, describe instructions for how certain events should occur or where items should be. One set explains how there would be a hole the player would route water into, revealing a key elsewhere in the building. There's a note about the time puzzles across Midwich explaining what they should look like. These notes feel like rough sketches of early puzzles and problems in Midwich in the hospital, and they're likely from Owaku. In one specific image, the writer says they aren't good at using soft image. He then goes on to explain the art that would replace the dummy image. Soft image is the program used by artists, which tells us the writer of these notes isn't someone who has artistic skills. That excludes the director, since Toyama was also a background designer. Owaku, as programmer and riddle writer, seems the best fit to be the author of these notes. Many of the images contain conversational dialogue and jokes intended for other developers, meaning these were likely images Owaku passed to the art team to finalize the designs. Another picture is pure text describing the location of the Aglaufotis. There's also a strangely ambiguous image of a disembodied figure standing in a foggy background, with the red kanji for fog hovering over them. One card contains a quote from Geoffrey Chaucer and the Canterbury Tales. It's from The Knight's Tale. "Death is the end of every worldly sore." There's no context for what the quote was intended for, and it doesn't exist in the final game. But given the topic, it might have been intended as an opening quote, which was later replaced with the original, "The fear of blood tends to create fear for the flesh." Toyama was the central writer. Owaku may have come up with the idea of an intriguing opening line, and Toyama may have decided to write an original one rather than quote Chaucer. Programming wasn't only involved in designing riddles, it also relates to characters Character programming creates the system that controls how characters move and interact with their environment, and that job would fall to programmer Mizuochi Yuki, and most of his work would involve Harry Mason, the protagonist, the character with the most movements in the game. An early memory Toyama has of Mizuochi's role involves a comical element he added to the protagonist's movements. Character controls at the time were simplistic and involved motion file management, where the program file for a character's actions were named for what they were. When a character falls down, those actions are controlled by a file called _down. Mizuochi saw this and had the thought to include a more detailed version of down. If the protagonist steps backward over something, he'll actually fall down on his behind. Toyama liked it, and it was added to the game. Toyama Kiichiro wrote the story in Japanese before handing it to Harry Inaba for translation. This final translated script was sent for editing to Latina International Corporation, an outside group that handles localization for video games. But while the general text of the game was likely a final product of this outside group, the dialogue would find itself in Inaba's hands. He would be involved in checking the translation, casting the voices, directing the voiced recordings, and modifying the lines, and directing the post-editing of the scenes. As director of voice acting, Inaba was present for all the recording sessions and was the only member of the dev team to be involved. They were done in a small, nondescript recording studio and in total took about less than a week, with the longest sessions going to the protagonist, Harry Mason. His voice was provided by the enigmatic Michael G., who for many years was unknown to the gaming industry due to his missing last name. William Lockwood from Rely on Horror rediscovered and interviewed him in 2018. His name is Michael Gwynn, and he had worked with Inaba for almost a decade, recording voices for games at Konami. Before Harry, he was also the infamous Dracula from Castlevania.
What is a man? A miserable little pile of secrets!
Of all the voice actors, Michael Gwynn would have the most influence on the script, one of the longer ones he'd worked with at the time, running as long as 60 pages. Inaba welcomed feedback on anything that felt unnatural or slightly off. Gwynn doesn't remember making many changes, though Inaba's tweets portray an image of the two of them poring over it together that week. They worked long into the night, which wasn't normal for voice acting at the time. There wasn't a lot of prep time, but Gwynn felt he was pretty good at cold reading things. Working with Inaba was delightful, Gwynn remembers. He recalls the man was incredibly bilingual and multicultural, which wasn't always the case in Japan at the time, and felt that Silent Hill itself was a very unique project. Gwynn didn't struggle to communicate with and understand Inaba, and he displayed a deep understanding of English that many other directors at the time didn't have. So why is it Silent Hill has a reputation for bad voice acting and strange dialogue? Silent Hill avoided many of the issues that plagued early games with voice acting. They hired professional voice actors with years of experience behind them. That included Michael G., as well as Liz Momorsky for Dahlia Gillespie, an artist and voice actor who would go on to work in The Sims and Baten Kaitos. Jerry and Monroe is Dr. Kaufman, a TV, theatrical, and voice actor who's worked in dozens of projects, most famously as Lynch from Kane and Lynch. Susan Papa as Sybil, a TV actress and producer. Thessaly Lerner as Lisa Garland, who's quite literally voiced thousands of characters across various animation and TV projects. The only team member with no record before or after Silent Hill is Sandra Wayne, the young girl who voiced both Alessa and Cheryl. Smaller roles would be filled by members already on the team. For instance, the scene in the hospital basement at the end of the game. One of the extra doctors was played by Gwynn. The other was Inaba himself, with Gwynn directing him.
Half the soul is lost. That is why the seed lies dormant.
And what soul remains captured in that husk is buried deep down in the subconscious.
Early demos of the game had no voice acting. The January 1999 demo is entirely silent throughout the conversation between Sybil and Harry, and there are slight differences between the subtitles on these cutscenes and what would eventually end up in the game. Sybil asks Harry how you feel in the demo, and in the final, how do you feel? But far more noticeable is that scene, the most famous line of dialogue that's been riffed over and over since the game released. The demo version reads, "What's going on with that radio?" The final version is,
Radio.
What's going on with that radio?
In the Michael G. interview, Gwyn explains he was asked to leave a 1-second pause before and after every line he read. It creates a strange, unnatural way of speaking, something that doesn't feel completely normal, and it feels very familiar to anyone who's enjoyed the works of David Lynch, such as the TV show Twin Peaks.
It is happening again.
She's dead. Wrapped in plastic.
There was a fish in the percolator.
Lynch's works are in many ways strange and unnatural. They are incredibly unique, and there are many examples of dialogue which is given in strange patterns of speech. It gives the scene an ethereal, almost alien feeling, as if we can't be sure we're in the real world anymore. It's an effect that works well in Lynch's works, and is possibly one the team was trying to emulate in their game. He's undoubtedly the most famous person behind the Silent Hill series. Fans the world over know Yamaoka Akira's name, and the influence he's had on the games as a whole. What started as a composing job evolved into sound editor, music supervisor, and even producer. Longer than any member of the original teams, Yamaoka has been part of the lifeblood of Silent Hill. But for the first Silent Hill game, it's not certain how much influence he had. He's not mentioned in Toyama's recollection of the first year of development, and it's well known the project was already underway when Yamaoka heard of it and appealed to his superiors to be assigned to the team. He may have been working on other projects, including Suikoden 2 until late 1997, and may not have been as involved in this game as he would be in the rest of the series. Yamaoka drew on industrial music for his concepts, a genre that uses harsh metallic sounds, a blend of electronic music and punk. The world of Silent Hill was full of metal and rust, and his music used sounds that felt as if they'd exist naturally in such a world. He would compose all the music and mix all the sounds, and in interviews says he was behind all the sound effects of the games. The game's credits also name Scott Greener of Transmedia as the game's audio engineer, a person that creates and mixes all the sound effects and noise of a game, from opening doors to footsteps to random breaking glass and distant scream. Between the two of them, the world of Silent Hill would have a sound all its own. Creating music for a game is a unique experience. Compared to a movie, where the story is played out a certain way start to finish, a game is interactive. Yamaoka had to consider how players would play and explore the game, knowing he had no real control over the players' actions. The order that they explored the town, the rooms they went into, the freedom they had to be considered when deciding how to spread out the style of music, the sounds that played, and the musical changes that occurred. To him, silence is as much of a sound as music is. He purposefully aimed to create tension in the game by interspersing the use of both. A major scene or special reveal might occur in total silence, while an empty hallway might have a strangely intense musical score. At times, musical cues would begin a few seconds before a certain event or shift in the game. The dissonance is powerful. In those early days, the PlayStation, while better than what came before, was still limited. Memory was a major concern and something Yamaoka was constantly watching to be sure they didn't run out of space. He didn't create based on a scene or an image that would be in the game. He knew the story and the experience they were aiming for, and worked from there. Programmers would help him estimate how much time players would spend in a specific area, so he'd have an idea of how much content to create. He drew inspiration for the music from real life, walking down a street late at night, by yourself, and sudden sound breaks the silence and makes you panic. Those kind of things were what he was attempting to create in his work, something grounded in the real world. The first title's music was mostly his work, some of which would only be revealed years later, when the Silent Hill Sounds box would be released, containing soundtracks of the games up to that point. It included a song made in those early years that wasn't used in the first Silent Hill. The song is called Azusa One Go. If you play the whole song alongside the original E3 trailer, as Lord Stan Deluxe on YouTube did, it seems clear the song was made for the video. It ends with the sounds of a car crash, just as the video does. However, the song wasn't used with the video, and never appeared again until the Sounds box release. the truth of the song became clear in an interview Yamaoka did on the Bokeh Studios YouTube channel.
僕サイレントヒルを最初富山君と作ってる時に一番最初にトレーラーの映像があってサイレントヒルのでトレーラーの音楽を僕が作りますっていう風になってで作ったんです。で富山君に、それ聞いてもらった時になんか違うなみたいななんか「おいいね」とか「オーサム」とかじゃないんですよ。ちょっとその時どんな風に言われたかちょっと覚えてないんですけどちょっと違うなっていう感じだったんですよ。で自分的にはすごくこうホラーであり怖いっていうことは音楽としてきちっと描いてるつもりだったんですよね。なんだけどその時にそれ言われて今でも覚えてますけど夕方ぐらいですよ。夕方ぐらい言われてどういう音楽なんだろうと思って家帰る途中でもいろいろ考えてたんですよ。どういう音楽だろうなと思って。で全くホラーっていうものとはちょっとこう違う音楽性を作ろうと思って本当に30分とか1時間ぐらいで作ったのがサイレントヒルの1のマンドリンで入るオープニングでイントロからマンドリンで入る曲なんですけどあれをなんか思いついてっていうのがあったんですね。であれがあったからなんか僕自身もサイレントヒルっていうところとかものづくりクリエイティブに関してなんか自分はこうですって自分はこう思いますっていうことをなんかなんでしょうねなんかぐさって一回刺されて一回内臓を出されてバーンって広げてってなった時にじゃあ自分どうすんだっていうことをなんか彼はやってくるんですよ。ある種なんだろう命の恩人ではないですけど僕としてはクリエイティブの何かこう恩人というかすごいあれがあの時のなんか感覚というか富山君にはそれはあってすごく感謝もしてますし今でも覚えてるぐらいの印象なんですね。
There was one song in Silent Hill Yamaoka was not involved in, one of the ending themes, a unique, powerful song that Yamaoka honestly wasn't all that sure about. Esperandote, the theme that plays after the bad ending, was the work of Muranaka Rika. Muranaka was born in Tokyo, but her musical talents would find her traveling the world to Chicago while she was still a teenager to study jazz piano. She returned to Japan in 1992 and was immediately offered a record deal. She was already a major success by the time she started working in video games. Her goal in creating music is to expose people to things they've never heard before, to share genres and styles of music which are lesser known. That was part of the inspiration behind her song in Silent Hill. The song Esperandote would be in Spanish, which was her idea, one Yamaoka was not entirely sold on. She pitched it hard and managed to convince him before flying out to Buenos Aires to find authentic tango musicians for the song. It was recorded in Argentina and sung by Vanessa Quiroz. Though she jokes that Yamaoka hated her during that time, Muranaka says they became good friends. The game came from a desire to enter the horror game genre because of the success of Resident Evil. That was the project's starting point. But more than that, it was in some ways part of Silent Hill's very DNA. The project was led by a young director and an inexperienced team, and they used Resident Evil as a way to prop up their inexperience. Many of the game's systems started as a complete copy of Resident Evil, and some of those copies remained even as the game was published. The team simply didn't have the time or ability to make everything from scratch.
フォーカスしてるところはあるけど、こことりあえずどうしますみたいな時は、ぶっちゃけとりあえずバイオと同じものの作っといてくださいって。
出た。忙しい時にディレクターがよくやる技。もう本当に手が回らない時に僕もなんかやったことあるんですよ。あれと一緒でいいからやっといてって言って、でこっちって大事なことを考えてる暇にちょっと細かいことは 本当に困った時ありますね。
製品版でもめちゃめちゃ名残で残ってるのはポーズメニューですね。ポーズメニューがなんか世界観がちょっと違うんですよね。再現できるなのに、なんかちょっとバイオチックな体力が落ちるとパルスみたいなのがっていうのが、それはその時の名残のままそこなんていうか。
One similarity comes in healing your character, using items found by foraging around the map. But where Resident Evil uses herbs, Silent Hill would use health drinks, first aid kits, and ampules. The last two were based on real-world health objects, but where did the idea of a health drink come from? It was inspired by an energy drink called Lipotivan that comes in a brown bottle. It was one of many elements of the game Toyama had intended to change before release that just remained as it was. Health was a major problem for the team, specifically how to indicate to the player they lacked health. A central policy of Silent Hill is the lack of health bars or game-like aspects on the main screen. Head programmer Imamura Akihiro felt it was important for the atmosphere to keep those aspects limited. They had to indicate the player's health in other ways. A major one came from a unique programming system summarized in its patent filed March 3, 1999. The problem: how can the player know the state of their character's health without interrupting their play? The solution: a controller that puts out a vibration that corresponds to the player's health level. The patent describes the heartbeat function that makes the controller vibrate and change with your character's health, an innovative way to indicate damage, and it's attributed to team programmer Kitai Soichiro. Directing was a nerve-wracking concept for Toyama. He was only 26, 3 years into his first job, and it was a lot of pressure. His openness to discussing the project and writing with a team likely came in part from his insecurity, but he found a way to delve into the project and enjoy it, once he connected it back to his youthful passion for the occult. Magic symbols and occult objects are strewn throughout Silent Hill. UFOs arrive in one ending to kidnap the hero, alchemical symbols appear in puzzles and backgrounds. The entire team had grown up in the occult boom, but none had fallen in love with it like Toyama had. Toyama loved the unexplained and loved things that took time to unravel. His childhood playing adventure games like Druaga inspired his desire to make the game difficult, to include puzzles and aspects that could be overlooked or only solved on a second playthrough. He was also quite fond of imperfect horror that gave a warped sense of discomfort because of how off or wrong things were, in the sense that they didn't seem believable. The more random, stylized elements of the game likely stem from this desire to embrace the absurd. The occult wasn't his only influence, however. Toyama spent his childhood reading manga and watching anime, and quite a few of those made their way into Silent Hill. When Toyama was writing the end of Silent Hill, where Sybil is defeated by Dahlia and Harry arrives just in time, he was picturing the 12 Palaces arc of Saint Seiya, in which Seiya runs out of power but Iki arrives. The bad ending, in which Harry is left alone with a child, came from Sailor Moon S. More generally, he mentions the manga series Crystal Dragon as an influence on all his creative works. And of course, Morihoshi Daijiro. But what were they going to call their game? A working title early on was Incubator, but Toyama didn't understand what it meant. Someone on the team was from an area called Shizuoka. They translated that town's name into its literal English translation and came up with a name: Silent Hill. The fourth annual E3 convention was a big one, with more than 70,000 people appearing at the event. Major publishers putting out big money to attract attention to their games, including hiring Hummer limos to pick up journalists at the airport, complete with copies of Gran Turismo playable in the back. It was for the second and final time to occur in Atlanta, Georgia, in the Georgia World Congress Center. The year before, director Toyama came to see the United States for the first time. In 1998, his game would make its world debut, and would take the industry by surprise. Before its debut, the game received no press, as it was overshadowed by the daunting presence of Metal Gear Solid. But after everyone got the chance to see it at E3, that all changed, and magazines began to rave about the coming title until its launch the next year. The Konami booth was heavily Metal Gear Solid themed, with a makeshift enemy base built on the convention floor, with actual gun-toting, half-naked buff guys and a Meryl cosplayer taking photos with fans. But another corner of that set had a small section dedicated to Silent Hill, and it attracted just as much attention. A television was playing the CG introduction to the game on loop, and early demos were available for fans to play. People fell in love with Silent Hill's FMV cutscenes. FMV stands for full motion video, and it refers to any pre-recorded or pre-rendered video that plays in a game. Silent Hill was one of the best examples of high-end FMV on the PlayStation during that era, and it took the entirety of E3 1998 by surprise. Game magazines loved it. This love of Silent Hill's cutscenes would not end after the event. Magazines would continue to comment on it, and interviews would ask about it, specifically about who made it and how. Sato Takayoshi became a household name for magazines covering the game, in a way few CG designers at the time did. They were shocked to find Sato was the only artist to work on the scenes, that he had begun working on them when the project began and never stopped. For about 2.5 years, working 15-hour days, 7 days a week. When Sato was assigned to the Silent Hill team, it came after the man made his boss an ultimatum. He wanted to work on a 3D project or he'd stop teaching his superiors. His boss had agreed, but the man was still looking for a supervisor to oversee Sato's work. Japanese tradition still held that a junior member of the company wouldn't be credited as the lead in such a project. Sato would be doing the work, but in the official credits he would be assigned a lower position below someone who had been in the company for some time. He felt that was wrong, and after an argument on the subject with his boss, he was told he could have the credit if he did all the work alone. So he did, working incredibly long hours. Between his work on Parodius and Silent Hill, Sato Takayoshi would spend almost 3 years living in the office, never going home.
ゲーム業界も比較的健全にはなってますけど、当時やっぱり会社に住んでる人ちょこちょこいましたからね。
まあそうですね。だし、まあこれはちょっと誤解を与えるかもだけど、合宿みたいでちょっと楽しいかなと思ってたりするところもなくもなかった。
今のゲーム作りも楽しいですけど、あんなにしんどかった昔の方がなぜか思い出補完だと思うんですけど楽しかったんですよね。なんかあの時めっちゃしんどかったけどめっちゃ楽しなかったっていう。だから今のゲーム制作に比べたら昔の方が自由度実は高くって、で環境が割と地獄で、一言で言うとなんかやっぱりあの時若くてみんな若くてがむしゃらだったっていう、その当時の人たちとお酒飲んで超楽しいですよね。なんだろうねあれ、その同窓会、プラスアルファみたいなところがなんかありますよ。単なる同窓会じゃない。はい、すごくなんかもう理屈性なくなんかこう同じ目ひどい目にあって同じようにいいゲーム作るために一生懸命だった。
The 90s were a time of transition for video games. Beyond the shift from 2D to 3D, it was a time in which what games portrayed and how came under greater scrutiny. Games were becoming more realistic and more graphic, and the question of what was appropriate and what was safe was becoming more important. In gaming circles, the focus was often on the idea that games were growing up, trying to appeal more to adults than children and teens. After its debut at E3, Silent Hill would be central to the adult game conversation in games media in the West. Reviews and opinion pieces all praised Silent Hill as an adult game, games that appeal to mature themes and real, complex conversations, rather than mere entertainment. One fan letter on the subject would say that what he wanted was more games like Silent Hill. But there was a problem. Games had, for a long time, been rather tame compared to other media, and for that reason had long been associated with kids. Games magazines were heavily kid and teen focused, and while it wasn't entirely an audience made of the youth, it was certainly a chunk of it. And here was a game that was certainly not meant for that audience. A letter written late in 1999 from a concerned mother would directly link the worry about mature games and children to Silent Hill. So what to do with the game? After E3, the Konami team was still busy working on the game, and demos, designed by demo team Sato Naoko, Ando Takayuki, and Tsuboyama Masashi, were being put together and sent out to magazines well ahead of the release date, with the game itself still not past the finish line. Gaming magazines had a choice: put out the demo and risk alienating or angering a part of their audience, or fail to release the demo and undercut their own argument that a genre of mature games should exist. Each magazine handled it differently. The UK PlayStation magazine put out a late notice informing fans they'd removed the Silent Hill demo from their disc. PlayStation Australia released a demo disc with the intro video from the game but no playable demo. In total, 2.2 million demo discs would eventually be shipped out with PlayStation hardware and the underground CD magazine. The main Silent Hill team had problems concerning mature themes too. How mature was too mature? What would they be allowed to create? Most of these concerns were centered around their monsters. The larval stalker is a ghost monster that appears in a school-level, invisible childlike creature that causes the radio to emit static but doesn't harm the player. The player can't interact with them either, but that wasn't always the case. The original build allowed for the player to attack and kill the invisible child ghosts. The idea was eventually seen as going too far and was scrapped, and other child-themed monsters would face similar setbacks. In 1997, a terrible tragedy would shake Japan to its core: 2 children murdered by another child, in what is now known as the Kobe child murders. It was an awful tragedy that would have consequences for video games and censorship in Japanese media. The ability to portray violence, especially against children, would be tightened from then on. The E3 version of Silent Hill included a childlike creature with pale skin and no eyes. At that point, the game had yet to be approved for public release by the CESA, the Computer Entertainment Suppliers Association. It organizes many of the gaming events that are now well known in Japan and was involved in approving games for public retail launch, until the rating agency was turned into a separate branch in 2002. The child monster from the E3 version of the game was too childlike for the CESA, and so the monster designers went back to the drawing board. A second attempt was turned down, as was a third. It was only when the creature was made visibly inhuman with large claws that it was approved for Japanese release. This creature, the Mumbler, would appear in the version that would be sold in Europe and Japan, while the United States received the Grey Child, a version of the original monster. During the Tokyo Game Show in autumn of 1998, interviewers and writers from magazines across the world would be invited to Konami's Tokyo headquarters to talk to the team behind Silent Hill. More than a dozen magazines would print versions of this interview, the earliest appearing to be Edge magazine in December of that year. The promotional event and many more were organized by John Sloan, head of marketing for Silent Hill. He's thanked in one of the interviews alongside Ogasawara Ken, one of the game's producers. They, alongside the publicity team, would be in charge of making sure the world knew about Silent Hill, from sending out demos, placing advertisements and commercials, and participating in game shows. E3 was just the first. Silent Hill would also appear at the European Computer Trade Show, which occurred in September of 1998 in Olympia. That ECTS would reveal something interesting about the game's debut in Europe. The United States would receive the game first, which might lead to European buyers wanting to purchase the import from the US rather than European retailers. To forestall that, Konami announced at ECTS they would offer the American copies of the game at select retailers in Europe in March. Then, Silent Hill would appear at the Autumn Tokyo Game Show that October. The advertising campaign would begin in magazines in 1998, with dedicated ads with taglines that varied by region and country. One of them was "Death is no escape," over an image of Alessa's face. Another was, "If destiny interferes with reality, one man's determination may merely be what is determined by his fate." A French postcard advertising the game would read, "Are you really ready to discover another world?" magazines across the world would cover the game. You can find articles in Brazilian, Chinese, Dutch, English, Finnish, French, German, Russian, Spanish, and of course Japanese. Most of the 1998 coverage was centered on game shows and brief previews, but once the new year arrived, the magazines began receiving more information and more access, including the team interviews, playable demos, and eventually full copies of the game. Most, but not all, opinions were glowing. GamesMaster called the game an unliving nightmare, surely the nastiest, most gruesome game ever to bless the PlayStation. Discussing the game's popularity at the previous E3, Electronic Gaming Magazine said it was the Resident Evil killer, mentioned in nearly every major video game magazine's best of show lists. GameSpot's review closed like this: "In the end, Konami's first entry in the horror genre is a great beginning. Let's hope we've seen the start of a new franchise by the company." And IGN's closing: "Opting for a much more cerebral approach to the horror genre, Silent Hill prefers to patiently build up tension and suspense by teasing the imagination. Silent Hill cannot be beat." But of course, no opinion is universal, and there were people who found the game overhyped or not scary enough, though often those opinions tended to trend in a similar direction: not enough action or gore. It's being billed as the scariest game ever, which we can tell you straight away isn't true. There's only one big moment that'll make you really jump compared to the 5 or 6 of Resident Evil, and the gore content doesn't even come close. Commercials would air across the world in a 4-week TV campaign, including both English and Japanese TV spots. The Japanese posters and commercials would include a quote meant to encourage fans of horror to buy the game. The quote reads, "Fear, the essence is here," and was attributed to Suzuki Koji, author of the book series that inspired the film phenomenon The Ring. When Suzuki Koji's quote appeared alongside Silent Hill, it was the beginning of a wild storm of rumors and excitement about the game. It was at the very start of his major global popularity in 1999, the year after the first film, and another Ring book, movie, and TV adaptation were all coming out at the time. Multiple fans years later credit the appearance of Suzuki's name on the commercials as the reason for their seeking out the game. There are mentions in Japanese chat rooms of rumors that spread at the time that Suzuki Koji was himself involved in the project, that he'd written the story of the game. Toyama himself remembers there were quite a few people who mistakenly thought the author was involved in Silent Hill. There's no understating the importance and popularity of Sadako and Suzuki Koji's work in Japan, and putting his name on Silent Hill was a fantastic decision, undoubtedly part of why the first game sold bucket loads in Japan. The Western world's advertisements wouldn't have a famous writer to rely on. Instead, the ads were centered on the idea Silent Hill was so frightening it would drive you out of your mind. A television with clips from the game would be shown bouncing around a padded cell before ejecting the Silent Hill game and escaping out a window. Another ad showed a policeman entering a crime scene with close-ups of anxious people and sweating brows before revealing the game. The magazine ad showed a padded cell reading, "Your room is waiting. Check your sanity at the door." Toyama Keiichiro was afraid his game wasn't frightening at all. American playtesters insisted to him that yes, it was, and they were right. The game was a massive success, receiving generally positive reviews from fans and critics the world over. First, the United States and Canada would receive the game on February 23, 1999. And according to the nation's top retailers, it would debut at number 2 in the USA, just behind Siphon Filter, according to one source. Another would list it at number 5, behind Pokemon Red and Blue, Siphon Filter, and Mario Party, but above the brand new Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening. And yes, the release date was February 23rd and not January 31st, though for some reason that date has been popularized online. The official press release for the game and Konami's website both mark the date as February. Japan and Hong Kong would be next on March 4th. In Europe, it would be released on August 8th in the UK, France, Germany, Italy, Holland, Spain, and Portugal, and would also make its way to Australia around that time. A very unofficial pirated copy of the game would pop up in Russia that year from a hacked copy of an American game, but they wouldn't receive an official release. The game would sell over 2 million copies, giving it an American PlayStation Greatest Hits release, In the PAL region, covering Europe, the Middle East, South Asia, and Africa, it would become an essential Platinum's title, marking a PS1 game that sold over 400,000 units worldwide in its first year. It was a PS1 Books title, the top-selling label for Japan and parts of Asia. In November 1999, it received a Gold Award from the German VUD, which indicates a game that sold more than 100,000 copies across Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. It was given on September 30th, which means it sold that amount in the first month after release. In Japan, the game would sell more than 100,000 units its first week, opening at number 2 for top games sold in Japan. The next week would add another 50K, dropping it to 3rd place. It would remain on the top 30 list for 7 weeks, finishing out at more than 235,000 units sold before it fell off the list. That first year, from March until December, it would sell a total of 293,427 units, the 55th best-selling game in the country, averaging at about 1,600 units a week. KSET's official site would list the game as having sold 1.5 million units in Japan, the United States, and Europe in 1999.
新人ディレクターになってもう正直必死というか、もうだから分かんないのはもうバイオの真似をしろみたいなそんなところから入ってよそのゲームでなんかこうしてるからこうしたらいいのかなとか、もう会社の仕組みとか皆無でもう本当になんていうか同い年ぐらいの全員20代前半25、6というか、まあ20代は20代ですよ、20代しかいないところで、なんだろう、だからその時ってもうスケジュールがとかその予算バジェットがとかそんな単語一回も出てこなくてもう好きにやっていいよ、それで当たったらめっけもんだしダメならダメだしみたいな感じでやらせてもらえて、それはそれで悲惨なこともあったけど、よかったなっていうか、ああいう時代をやらせてもらってっていうこと。
Working on Silent Hill was an incredibly long, stressful process. Though it was successful, and rather quickly, the weight of responsibility on director Toyama's shoulders had started to get to him. He felt his inexperience had led him to mismanage his team, and that they might have done better without him. His mental health suffered greatly, and he made the choice, not long after his successful directorial debut, to leave Konami. Toyama wanted to start over from scratch, to rebuild his confidence, but years later he would reconsider the very flaws that he felt made him lacking in leadership in the first place. Since Silent Hill, he's directed 3 games in the Siren series, 2 in the Gravity Rush series, and is now working on his first independent work, Slitterhead. He feels now that his style of leadership, where he looks to his co-workers for influence and support, has allowed him to create works that are colored by many individual talents rather than being dominated by one, and that is something valuable. All these works have something similar in their DNA, a heavily stylized sense of place rooted in a unique environment and town, as well as a feeling that curiosity drives a character into a dangerous situation from which they cannot return, a style Toyama finds himself drawn to. Today, Toyama looks back at Silent Hill like a nostalgic hometown in his own words. He feels the series has become something wonderful on its own, in large part because of the teams who came after him, often naming Ito Masahiro in particular. He also hesitates to answer certain questions about the town. Fans have asked him about the boiler memo, wanting to know if Alessa was burned on purpose. He's been asked if the town's monsters are really monsters. In both cases, he hedges his answers, implying that he has his own interpretations of Silent Hill's lore, but that it might contradict or not match with the lore later teams developed. And it's not just his story anymore. Some of the team who helped create the horrifying town would leave it behind forever. Kaho Kazuyuki was lead artist on a project called Nanobreaker, working on both Silent Scope 2 and 3, was a designer on DDR Supernova, and a lead game designer on Dewey's Adventure and the sequel to Elebits. His name continues to appear on Konami patents into 2013. He is sometimes credited as Kaz Kaho. Kitai Soichiro started at Konami in 1991 and continued there through 2001, working on character models and movie events on Shadow of Destiny. There is little to no information available about him online. Kimura Mihoko is also an enigma. No work records can be found for her after Silent Hill. As for Toyama Keiichiro, he would find a new home at Sony Computer Entertainment, alongside Sado Naoko and Takahashi Isao, and his future career would heavily involve both of them, a story that continues with the Japanese PS2 series Forbidden Siren. Out of the fog came a horror unlike any other. A small, relatively inexperienced team created a masterpiece that sold more than 2 million copies by the end of its multiple printings. It was something of a miracle. Silent Hill did better than anyone could have predicted. The problem was how to follow it up. There hadn't been any plans to continue the concept. They hadn't been sure it would succeed. But once the game was done, the team couldn't help but feel frustrated. There was so much they'd been unable to do, having to cut concepts and pull back on their more ambitious ideas due to technical limitations. Within a week of Silent Hill's release, the PlayStation 2 was announced that March. It was as if the stars had suddenly aligned. This new, more powerful device seemed like what they needed to create the game they'd originally envisioned. So Silent Hill 2 began in September of 1999.